We are pleased this morning to have Annika Stensson from the National Restaurant Association present to us this morning. Annika is Director of Research Communications at the National Restaurant Association. She is responsible for raising the profile of the organization's multifaceted research and directing cohesive research communications in support of programs and initiatives across the organization. Her responsibilities include turning statistics, analysis, and trends data into strategic communications for reports, digital and social media, and resources for association members and news media. She also serves as expert spokesperson on restaurant, operator, and consumer trends. Stensson has collaborated with the research development for more than a decade on consumer polls and operator survey content. She is the primary developer of the organization's high-profile What the Chef survey and key contributor to the annual flagship restaurant industry forecast. Previously, Stensson has held various positions in the communications department since joining the NRA. A native of Sweden, she holds a journalism degree from the University of Maryland. Please join me in welcoming Annika.
Thanks so much. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, cool. Glad to be here to join you and try not to spill my coffee on the laptop, first of all. Welcome. Glad again to be here for the session of 10 things you need to know about the restaurant industry, according to National Restaurant Association research. Obviously, there are a lot more things than 10 things to know about the restaurant industry, but to condense it into this presentation, focusing on 10. And these are the 10, so I'll be covering a little more detail into each of these as we go along. And if you have questions along the way, feel free to raise your hand rather than hold them till the end, because I know how it is, you tend to forget things, and so do I. So if you do have them along the way, please just raise your hand. So first of all, the restaurant industry is a pretty big deal in the US economy. The scope and size is larger than a lot of other industries out there. But first, the official definition that we have of the restaurant industry is all meals and snacks prepared away from home, including all takeout meals and beverages. That's a little bit wider than most people think of when they hear the term restaurant. Of course, it's table service restaurants and limited service restaurants, but it's also much wider than that. Everything from caterers to coffee shops to managed services at college university dining halls, for example, concessions at sporting and entertainment venues, airports, got non-commercial food service, and also military food service. So with that in mind, these are our projections for this year. We expect sales to reach $799 billion in more than 1 million locations, supporting 14.7 million employees. And our industry really is an economic powerhouse. If the restaurant industry were a country, we would have a larger economic output than most countries around the world, including countries like Argentina and Thailand, for example. And sales growth alone in our industry is bigger than total sales for a lot of other industries. Like this example here, it's way more than Hollywood makes in a year. But because the industry is so large, there are a lot of variances between segments and geographies to take into account when it comes to performance. So overall, on the national level, we're projecting a 4.3% sales growth this year, or 1.7% in real terms, and adjusted for inflation. And this, as you can see, we've been tracking this for 47 years, and the current growth rate is pretty moderate compared to historical terms. And within segments, there are dozens of different segments that roll up into the overall restaurant industry, but just highlighting a few here. Table service is the largest segment by volume of sales, but it's not the fastest growing as far as sales. Quick service and fast casual, also known as limited service restaurants, the second largest by volume sales, but much faster growing when it comes to sales this year. And two other segments that are worth noting, they're much smaller by volume, but they have a much faster sales growth, and that's managed services, so contract food services, and snack and non-alcoholic beverage bars. That will be your coffee shops, juice bars, things of that nature. And geography also plays a role in sales growth performance of the industry, and a couple of different measures that are very important to a positive operating environment is overall population growth and overall employment growth. And that is not the same across the country. These are the 9 census regions. If you're wondering where the Midwest is, you might know this, but it's West North Central and East North Central. So you can see the stronger growth when it comes to people and employment are in the West and the Southeast. And these are important measures, of course, because it's simple math, really. If you have more people, you have more potential customers. And if people are employed, they have money to spend and also a greater need for convenience, which restaurants provide. And another measure that is important to look at is consumer confidence. That is also varying pretty greatly by region. Currently, we're seeing similar patterns with more positivity in the West and the Southeast, but also West and Midwest are a really positive bunch right now. Oh, and consumer confidence, of course, is important because if consumers feel good about the economy and about their personal financial situation, they're likely to loosen their purse strings and spend in restaurants and elsewhere. So following the same geographic trends with our sales projection for the restaurant industry this year, we're seeing the strongest sales growth projected, again, in the West and the Southeast. That would be the green and the blue on this map. But there are some variances in inlands too. But again, this is, if you recall, 4.3% is the national sales growth. So we're seeing a little bit above and below that, and that will be the gray states. And looking closer at the Midwest by state, we're seeing some variances here too. Naturally, the more populous states, the larger states, are leading the sales growth. Illinois, $25.2 billion in sales projected this year, followed by Ohio and Michigan. So again, where does the sales growth come from? Consumer dollars, of course. So looking at consumers, they have been pretty hesitant in their spending since the recession because the economic recovery has been relatively slow, but it's starting to change now, and that's good news. Overall, typical household expenditures on food is 13%, and that is food at home and away from home. Housing and transportation are the two biggest spending categories for U.S. households, but food is number 3. And breaking that 13% down a little bit further and looking back in time, back to 1955, this is, of course, when dining out was primarily reserved for special occasions, maybe business travel. Back then, people spent about 25% of their food dollar in the restaurant community. So fast forward to today, obviously, household structures have changed, our lifestyles have changed. The need for convenience is much, much greater now than it was 60-some years ago. So today, consumers spend almost half of their food budget in restaurants. And again, how consumers feel is very important to how they're going to behave when it comes to spending. So we've been tracking how they feel about the overall economy since before the recession, but I'm not going to show you those numbers. Those were horrible. So at least it's moving in the right direction. We want to see larger parts of the green and the blue. Obviously green, not a lot of people think it's excellent, but more and more think it's good. And now we're actually in the net positive of more people think it's at least fair. And that's, again, good news for consumer spending projections. And looking at consumer confidence on the national level, it is trending up. There have been some bumps in the road, but it's generally trending up, and it has been. We're basically at a post-recession high right now, and again, it looks like it's going to continue to head in that direction, so again, positive news. And another good measure of future spending of consumers is what we call pent-up demand for restaurant services. This is when we ask consumers if they are using restaurant services, dining out, and takeout and delivery as often as they would like. And back in 2006, that was fairly low, 27%. People are pretty satisfied with their dining behavior. Now we're 12 points higher than that, but not as high as in 2013. That was when it's peaked right after the recession, when unemployment was higher. Consumers didn't have disposable income as much as they do today. So the good news is, as far as those numbers go down, that tends to translate into spending in restaurants and elsewhere in the economy. But not everything is good news, of course. There are more factors that influence the operating environment than consumers, obviously. And still in the good news column, but not as good as it could be, is wholesale food prices are trending down. 2016 was the second consecutive year they were trending down, so that's good news. But as you can see, in the last decade, there have been some pretty significant spikes. I'm sure you all have felt it along the way. And that obviously leaves some pressure on bottom lines. And the good news of food costs going down are really offset by labor costs going up, and quite a bit. So it's actually almost 2 to 1 there. And that's obviously not great news. Labor costs and food costs both take up about a third each of sales in a typical restaurant, so huge categories there to keep an eye on. And meantime, menu price growth has stayed relatively moderate, definitely not 1 to 1 as far as food costs to offset that, so that also leaves some pressure. And on top of that, grocery store prices are actually trending down by quite a bit and have been for a while, so that really challenges the consumer's value perception of restaurants versus grocery store food. And overall, macroeconomic indicators are doing okay. They're not great, but they are heading in the right direction with some bumps in the road, but there is at least potential for growth ahead, even though it's not robust growth. Other headwinds, I say consumer spending will pick up when consumer confidence is higher. That is true, but of course only if they have money to spend. And while disposable income is growing, it started to slow in 2016, and hopefully that will pick back up in 2017 and 18. We'll see about that. And real household income, meaning the money they have to spend in the economy, is actually lower than prior to the recession when adjusting for inflation. So while consumers might want to spend, they don't have the cash to do so as much as they want quite yet. And when it comes to gas and diesel prices, they've been trending down, but they're expected to rise this year. And that is obviously diesel impacts the supply chain side of things, while gas, if you recall, transportation was the second largest spending category for U.S. households. So if gas prices go up, money is going to be put into that category from other categories. And along all those challenges, there is one challenge that has been rising to the top as of late, and that is recruiting and retaining employees. We poll restaurant operators each month to see what their number one challenge is in their operations. And this is a snapshot of the month of January for the last 3 years. In 2014, recruiting and retention was not that big a deal, challenge for some, but definitely not all. That has about tripled by now. And that is, of course, partly because our labor costs also follow along that suit. And this is partly why the overall economy keeps adding jobs, and we now have more jobs online than there were prior to the recession, which means the labor pool is much shallower, and that leads to larger competition for qualified employees, not just within the restaurant industry, but also with other industries. And we're likely to see this challenge stick with us for quite a while, as there is job growth ahead. Again, the restaurant industry currently employs 14.7 million employees. We're the second largest private sector employer in the U.S. after healthcare, and have actually been adding jobs at a pretty fast clip. 2017 is actually the 18th consecutive year in which restaurant industry job growth will outpace overall national job growth. So in the next decade, the industry will create 1.6 million new positions, and the strongest growth categories within those are those for supervisors, cooks, and combined service and prep workers. And along that, another challenge in a different way is that labor force demographics are changing. The restaurant industry is the largest U.S. employer of teens. 1 out of every 3 employed teenagers work in the restaurant industry, but that's about to change. The labor force participation by teenagers has been trending down for the last several years, dropping fairly sharply, and is projected to continue to do that into the future. So those teens tend to fill a lot of part-time positions, seasonal positions, so restaurant operators are obviously looking for new sources of labor for a lot of those. And as you can see here, 65 and older, that demographic is growing pretty strongly. So some seniors are either staying in the workforce longer or returning to the workforce for a variety of reasons, but a lot of them are looking for part-time seasonal work, so that might be a good source going forward. However, it will require some different strategies as far as employee engagement, for example, or recruitment and retention strategies. So leaving behind the hard data of jobs and sales and economy and moving on to other trends in the industry. Obviously, technology is a large trend across the board and in our industry as well. While the human element in customer service is still very, very important, and consumers very much still want that to happen, they are recognizing the benefits of technology. And currently, 1 out of 4 consumers say that they actually factor in the availability of technology options when they choose where to dine if they have 2 similar restaurants to choose from. And some of the tech that they're using in store are these. Wi-Fi, more than half have used that in the last year. And tableside payment, also pretty common. And then down a little bit less common is ordering. About a third of consumers have done that. But 29% have used none at all when it comes to that. Obviously, part of that 29% is likely because these technologies are not available in every restaurant quite yet. So we also ask consumers a hypothetical of if it were available, would you use it? And as you can see, the numbers jump pretty significantly, indicating that acceptance is there, except for 18%, so almost 1 out of 5 consumers still say that they're not willing to use any of these technologies. And smartphones, seems like everyone has one these days, and that's almost true. We actually surveyed consumers, and more than 3/4 of consumers currently have a smartphone. Higher in younger age groups and a little lower in older age groups, like all things technology tend to be. But still pretty significant proportions there. So we asked them what the restaurant-related tasks they use their smartphones for. And turns out the most common ones are finding basic information, so maybe not surprising that that's it. From locations, directions, looking at menus, but also ordering takeout and delivery is pretty common, actually more common than not that consumers do that on their phones. So again, overall, consumers are generally on board with the benefits of technology. They say it increases convenience, speeds up service, and order accuracy, but 37%, almost 2 out of 5, say that it complicates the restaurant experience for them. That is obviously the opposite reaction that you want from use of technology. It's supposed to make things easier. This number, again, like most things technology, is a little higher among older age groups and a little lower among younger age groups, but not as much as you might think. So it's vital that whatever systems you have are very user-friendly on the front end, as well as play well with the inventory, POS, whatever you have on the back end. So again, what's in it for restaurateurs? There is obviously an investment to be made to implement any tech system in a restaurant. And just some food for thought with these numbers, consumers think it makes more dining out more fun. And 3 out of 10 actually say it makes them dine out or order delivery more often. That's a good thing. And again, 26% say it actually makes them choose one restaurant over another. So it comes down to competitive edge. And moving on to the more general consumer space, more specifically the food space, to see what's going on there. Quite a lot, actually. Over these last few decades, dining out really has become an everyday activity. And with that, a typical consumer today is very different than a typical consumer was even just 10 years ago. Today's consumer is much more experienced when it comes to dining out, much more knowledgeable and sophisticated when it comes to food and dining than previous generations. And obviously, convenience has been a huge driver of industry growth over time, but social enjoyment is really a big, big deal for why consumers love to dine out. And it's perhaps not a huge shocker that a majority of consumers say that dining out is a better use of their free time than cooking and cleaning up at home. But of course, it's not just about the time spent, it's about the food itself. Even though they are pretty sophisticated, pretty knowledgeable about food, they don't necessarily know how to cook it. I am certainly one of these 7 out of 10 consumers who can't produce restaurant quality food at home. And again, with these more experienced consumers, they have a lot of points of reference when it comes to dining out, so they know what's good and they know what they like. And restaurant operators certainly have noticed this, that consumers' expectations of food quality, as well as menu diversity, has really increased just in the last 2 years. And in trends terms, 2 years is a very short time period, and to see numbers this high in the 90s means it's a very, very strong trend. So again, menu diversity is also tied to, if you dine out a lot, you want to eat different things so you don't get bored, and that's what consumers are looking for as well. And operators are responding. A majority say that they have expanded their menus over the last couple of years. And this is not necessarily adding a number of new dishes. It can be just adding customization elements, for example, or build your own features that would allow the consumer to have more choice. And again, looking at this more experienced consumer, they certainly do know what they want, and they want that whenever and wherever they dine out. That indicates that their decision matrix is becoming more based on ideas and concepts than on specific occasions, as has been largely the way in the past. So they look more at the characteristics of food as opposed to individual ingredients these days. And some of those larger concepts or ideas are these. We ask consumers, if you have two similar restaurants, would any of these factors tip your scale to go to choose one over the other? 70%, 7 out of 10, say that healthy menu items would actually make them pick one restaurant over another. 2/3 say locally sourced food would do the same, 6 out of 10 like eco-friendly food, and 4 out of 10 say diet-specific food like vegetarian or gluten-free, for example, would make a difference for them. Again, nutrition has been a huge trend in overall society, obviously in food as well, and restaurants have done a fantastic job stepping up to the plate and offering a wider variety of healthful options across the board. And the good news is that a majority of consumers are noticing. And not only are they noticing, they're also ordering more of these, or at least they say they are. This is based on self-reporting by consumers, but 2/3, this is a pretty significant proportion, is say they actually order these as opposed to just like to see them on the menu. And again, with this more sophisticated consumer, they're also taking their own health into their own hands. They're not necessarily just looking for items that are labeled healthy in general on menus. They're actually looking for what's healthy to them. It can be anything from, as I mentioned, gluten-free or vegetarian food, vegan food, or anything that fits into whatever the diet trend of the day is, paleo, for example, or Atkins, if anyone is still on that, or sodium-conscious cuisine, allergy-conscious cuisine, things of that nature. So 1 out of 3 consumers say they tend to adhere to one of those kinds of diets when they dine out. That's a lot of customization that may or may not be necessary depending on what they want, but it's something to keep in mind that, again, the diversity of a menu is very important these days. And again, operators have noticed this in their diners as well. Again, 2 years is a very short time period when it comes to trends, and these numbers are very strong across the board. About 9 out of 10 operators say that their consumers definitely are more into diet-specific food today. And when it comes to local, that is also a big decider in a consumer's decision matrix today. Again, about 2/3 of consumers say that that would make them pick one restaurant over another. So we have long known, just from anecdotal information, that consumers tend to see locally sourced food as healthy and fresh and high quality. So we wanted to document this, and it turns out, while they do think that, the primary reason for at least half of consumers here is that it supports their local business neighbors. So that's good to know. From a marketing mix standpoint, if you're working with local farmers or local food producers, go ahead and put that on the menu or in marketing materials so the consumers know about it. And when it comes to offering locally sourced food, we are actually to a majority of restaurants doing this when it comes to locally sourced produce. Not necessarily 100% of the produce served in the restaurant, but at least some. 19% is not a majority, you might say, and you're absolutely right. Here in the QSR section, this question actually had a slight underrepresentation of quick service restaurants in it, so the margin of error on that particular one is fairly large. So in reality, it's probably closer to half, just like the other segments. Eco-friendly, also something that consumers really care about. Similar to locally sourced food, it can be hard to define. There's no universal definition. Organics obviously has standards around it, but just eco-friendly in general and locally sourced in general are a little bit hard to define, so more perception issue there. But operators are also offering more of the eco-friendly food variety. Sometimes that is a crossover with local sourcing, but not always. So not quite a majority yet, but it's moving toward that. And same thing here on a wider scope, just with that wider decision matrix that our consumers have today. Operators certainly have noticed that as well, that consumers are paying a lot more attention to sourcing and production than they have been in the past. So for example, it's not so much about the latest trend or the hottest trend today being cauliflower or kale, for example, but it's more about, is that kale sourced locally, is it grown in an eco-friendly way? And another big trend, sort of an umbrella trend here, macro trend, is international flavors or ethnic cuisines. And that is also something that is growing significantly just over the last several years. It has been an evolving trend for many years, obviously, but it's really picking up speed. And more than half of consumers out there today say they eat a wider variety of ethnic cuisine today than just 2 years ago. And if you look at the younger age groups, that's even higher. And again, operators are following suit. If consumers want it, should give it to them, right? So it is becoming more common to offer ethnic cuisine items outside of your general menu theme. And most restaurant operators, at least in the table service segment, tend to think that that's going to be more popular in the future as well. So again, just to sum up what I've been saying about the trends becoming more concept-based and idea-based, that is something that operators have noticed as well. And again, it's something that is not going to change back to being ingredient-based anytime soon, so it is good to put on that wider thinking hat when it comes to menu strategies. And speaking of those menu strategies, looking at the top trends for food these days, again, the wider themes, we conduct a survey each year. This is the 11th year, partnering with the American Culinary Federation to survey professional chefs about what they see are trending on menus in the year ahead. So this is based on that as well as a couple of other pieces of research. And I should say here, when I'm talking about something being trendy, that's not necessarily the same as something being popular or common on menus. Something can be found pretty much everywhere and be very, very popular. Think chicken wings or hamburgers, for example. Or something can be found in only a few places and be considered super trendy. Perfect example a couple of years ago would be the cronut. So again, because we're seeing trends sort of widen into concepts and ideas, we broke our list down according to that. So we have one section of the top concept trends and one section of more food and ingredient-based trends. These are the top 10 when it comes to concepts. Some familiar themes here: nutrition, eco-friendly, local sourcing. That is obviously not a coincidence. Menus are largely driven by consumer demand, so if they want it, that's what we serve it. And obviously chefs are speaking here, so they sort of like the idea of the working with different ingredients and high quality ingredients like that. Chef-driven fast casual is basically a fine dining approach to quick service. Food waste reduction has ties to being eco-friendly, of course, but also some cost management strategies in the back of the house. The less you throw away, the less you have to buy when it comes to ingredients. Meal kits, pretty interesting. There are obviously companies out there that are exclusively dedicated to producing meal kits and selling them to consumers. Grocery stores are getting in that game. Not a lot of restaurants have done that yet, but they might going forward. Would be seemingly a natural fit since food is being prepped and measured in the back of the house for meals to be prepared on site, to package that and sell it to the consumer to be cooked at home might be the next natural step. And the other part of the list that I mentioned is the food-based, ingredient-based trends, and those are the ones we're seeing here. Still, we're seeing those similar trends, local sourcing, or mostly house-made in this case. But we're also seeing, again, sustainability, nutrition, some African flavors, ethnic-inspired breakfast items, authentic ethnic cuisine. Those are obviously evidence of those international flavors that I mentioned. New cuts of meat, obviously not just new bits and pieces of animals that we're just discovering now. These are butchery and marketing terms for those kind of cuts. Again, we're talking about chefs who say this is the hottest trend. They love to work with those because they pack a lot of flavor. You can do a lot with them. They also tend to be at a lower price point than traditional premium cuts. And also looking at limited service restaurants, we surveyed operators on this end to see if the same thing's trending on those kind of menus, and indeed they are. Same themes, local, eco-friendly, nutritious, as well as a hint of international flavors here. And looking at what's moving up and what's moving down, here we're just doing analysis on the chef survey and the other limited service menu research and seeing what moves up and down. What's cooling down here are obviously crossing over with those diet-specific foods that consumers are really ramping up to. But just because a trend is cooling off doesn't mean that it's going away, doesn't mean you shouldn't pay attention to it. In this case, except for black rice, don't really know what that's doing there. We're going to see in the end, I guess. But the others on this list of cooling down trends are moving toward becoming menu staples, evergreens, perennial favorites on menus. So it kind of forces them into the new normal to have a presence on menus as opposed to being kind of a novel, trendy thing. And as far as heating up, get a little bit of a mixed bag here. Only time will tell where these are going, but these are things we've heard about for the last couple of years, but again, they're really starting to evolve. And taking out the crystal, yeah? Poke. It is basically Hawaiian ceviche. It's a raw tuna, usually marinated, and served as a basically tuna salad with raw tuna. And breaking out the crystal ball a little bit, not a full crystal ball, this is actually based on the research that we do as a whole at the NRA, but just to see trends to watch that we're seeing moving in one way or one direction or another, I should say. Local sourcing, again, I probably sound like a broken record, and again, in culinary circles, local sourcing has been a thing for a long time, but America is a huge country. There are more than 1 million restaurants, 300 million people. Only recently has it actually entered mainstream as far as being featured on restaurant menus and being part of the marketing mix. But the next shift that we're seeing now is that it's going to be more common than not to have at least some locally sourced items on menus. It's obviously very difficult to have 100% locally sourced items on your menu because that would be very restrictive, especially if it looks like this outside. But again, it's something that we're seeing is going to be sort of more common than not going forward. And the ethnic cuisines as well, this has also had been a long evolving trend, but it's really picking up speed as of late. And some cuisines at this point are so common and so popular that they're hardly considered ethnic anymore, like Italian, Mexican, Chinese, for example. But I'm talking about the sort of second tier and even third tier of cuisines that we're really starting picking up speed now and becoming more recognizable. In the consumer space and in the restaurant space. We've had, over the last few years, waves of Southeast Asian and Middle Eastern, and now we're sort of moving into African flavors. These are largely underexplored on this continent, but maybe not for much longer. And again, street food, obviously tying into these ethnic cuisines as well, but moving from sort of street carts to food trucks to limited service space. Now we're seeing adaptations for more upscale versions of those to be served on plates, eaten with a knife and fork in a sit-down restaurant. So seeing a lot of deconstruction of these things, like a deconstructed taco. I think I prefer the original, but you know what I mean. There are a lot of those starting in the limited service side with the burrito bowl, for example, technically a deconstructed burrito. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on as well. And quinoa was trending down as a hot trend, but it's not going anywhere, but it probably will be joined by other ancient grains like amaranth or flaxseed, for example, to be more explored and more widely used, probably coming soon to a grain bowl near you. And again, just highlighting some of the international flavors, global flavors that I've been talking about. We did a survey in 2015 that showed that 4 out of 5 consumers eat at least one ethnic cuisine per month, and nearly 1 out of 5 eat 7 or more ethnic cuisines per month. And again, this is in 2015. If you recall from a few slides ago, more than half of consumers say they eat a wider variety of ethnic cuisines now than 2 years ago. So chances are these numbers are higher now. And restaurants are the primary point of access for most of these. But ethnic cuisine is obviously not all about branching out and trying new things. It's also tied to comfort food. This is a very diverse country. A lot of heritage is out there. 2 out of 5 consumers actually say that the ethnic cuisines they like to eat is tied to their ancestry. But if you do try new cuisine, you tend to start with staples of that cuisine. So that would be if you're going to try Vietnamese for the first time, you might try a banh mi sandwich as opposed to going into the more rich, complex dishes. If you're trying French for the first time, you might go for beef bourguignon before you try the escargot, for example. But at the end of the day, again, just to highlight that ethnic cuisines these days really is so very ingrained in American diets, is that while consumers appreciate authenticity, at the end of the day, it doesn't always matter. It's not required. 7 out of 10 consumers, or I'm sorry, 2 out of 3 consumers say that it doesn't really matter if it's authentic as long as it tastes good. And that sums up pretty much the 10 things that you need to know about the restaurant industry today. We do have more research available on our website, restaurant.org, if you're interested, or feel free to ping me at any time. I thank you very much for your attention this morning. Stay safe in the snow and enjoy the rest of the show.